But first, the prospect of another lockdown here in London has been discussed by the Prime Minister and encouraged by the Mayor. Last week, Boris Johnson said if further restrictions are brought in, they would be for the capital as a whole, not individual boroughs. That's devastating for areas where the current COVID rates remain relatively low, as our political correspondent Simon Harris has been finding out.
Living south of the river isn't to everyone's taste, but in Bromley there are reasons to be more cheerful than some of their neighbours to the north. Bromley is one of a handful of South London boroughs which have the lowest COVID infection rates in the capital. So the possibility of an impending London-wide lockdown fills traders here with dismay.
Things are hard enough as it is at the moment. I don't know how we'd get through it. A lot of us are independent shops here. I really don't know how we'd get through it.
I can understand it if it was on certain areas that's very high. I understand that, but if it's not around, especially around where we are, I don't understand why it would have to.
According to the latest statistics, Merton is the borough with the lowest infection rate, 19 cases for every 100,000 people. Bromley recorded a similar figure with around 20 cases in every 100,000. In contrast, the worst borough is Redbridge in East London, with 70 cases per 100,000 people. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, thinks any new restrictions should apply to all of London, not just part of it. And the Prime Minister, in an interview with ITV News on Friday, questioned whether borough-by-borough lockdowns were realistic. So any new curbs on Londoners are likely to be across the capital, even in boroughs with a low infection rate. Bromley's MP is pretty sure how that will go down with people here.
Very badly, because it will be unnecessary in my view, and I think we should pull back from it. Bromley has a very different infection profile from parts of East London. And in fact, because nobody's commuting up to town, the idea that there'd be much intermingling between people living in Bromley and people over in the east side of London is pretty farcical, really.
Sisters Julie and Lorraine were Christmas shopping in Bromley today. Julie knows about COVID-19. Her husband caught it in April and spent 5 weeks in intensive care.
It's been the worst experience of mine and my 4 children's life. At one stage, we really thought we wasn't getting him back.
If the government said the whole of London had to go into lockdown again, would you understand that?
Yes, and I would totally agree, because I just feel that people don't take this illness serious enough.
Right now, the whole of London is on the government's watch list, even boroughs like this, where they've managed to keep a lid on new infections. Simon Harris, ITV News, Bromley.
A third of people who work in the arts say they are getting no financial support from the government while venues are closed because of the pandemic. To protest about the lack of help for freelancers, hundreds of musicians are protesting in London this lunchtime. This performance was followed by a period of silence to represent the freelancers who don't qualify for any government help. Simon Harris was watching.
What we saw in Parliament Square today was a pop-up protest lasting just 90 seconds. 400 musicians playing just long enough to be heard, but not long enough to draw a crowd. That was on the orders of the police. Well, I'm joined now by the classical violinist Tasmin Little. Tasmin, what effect has coronavirus had on your career?
It's had an absolutely devastating effect on my career. I haven't been able to play properly since March. I've given 2 very short, socially distanced events, and about 40 concerts of mine were cancelled.
And this was your retirement year?
This was and still is my retirement year, and I've postponed the retirement until the end of the year in the hope that I will be able to do some of the concerts that had been planned.
So do you feel your career is effectively over?
I think that if I can't do the concerts that I'm supposed to do before the end of the year, there's no question that my performing career is at an end.
That's devastating for you.
It has been completely devastating, and also I've had a very moving outpouring from audiences who've written to say how devastated they feel.
So what is it musicians want? Is it a government handout or the right to perform?
It's definitely not a government handout, no. We would like an opportunity to do what we do best, which is to perform and to be paid for it. And what would be fantastically helpful would be if the government could support us with a scheme which will allow concert goers to come and enjoy the concert, but the rest of the tickets that cannot be sold due to social distancing will be paid for by the government.
Tasmin Little, thank you very much for talking to us. Of course, this isn't just about about those who sing or conduct who play. Every musical performance needs lighting directors, technicians who do the sound, makeup artists and costume designers. All are feeling the effects of coronavirus.
Good evening. They protested at Parliament the best way they know how, through their music. 400 musicians played this morning and then stopped abruptly for a 2-minute silence to protest about the lack of support for freelance artists. A third who work in the arts say they are getting no financial help from the government. Asked about the support for musicians, artists and actors, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, said, as in all walks of life, everyone is having to adapt. Our political correspondent, Simon Harris, reports.
Much of the music industry is still in lockdown, but Parliament Square saw an extraordinary pop-up concert by 400 musicians. The police allowed the performers to play for no more than 90 seconds.
We have to not draw a crowd of any description, so we have to play for less than a minute and a half to ensure that happens.
The musicians are self-employed and desperate for government help.
Our members want to work. They want to be able to work for all sorts of reasons, mainly, of course, to make a living. If they're unable to do that because of the almost ban on live music the government has put in place, then we need financial assistance.
Coronavirus has meant an early end to the career of one well-known violinist.
I've had approximately 40 concerts cancelled that in fact I will probably not be able to reschedule because I'm stopping playing at the end of the year. So all my lovely retirement concerts and the celebrations that I was going to have finishing up my career have all gone.
After 1.5 minutes, the show was over. This wasn't just about those who sing or play or conduct. Musical performances need sound engineers, lighting technicians, makeup artists, costume designers. All are feeling the effects of the coronavirus musical drought. London's famous concert venues from the O2 to the Albert Hall are empty. The West End's musical theatres are silent. In Parliament today, MPs called on the government to come to the rescue.
In 2019, 18,000 performances across West End theatres attracted over 15 million audience members, providing a gross revenue of £800 million.
The government has announced a £1.5 billion rescue package for the arts. The Chancellor was asked about the lack of work for musicians.
As in all walks of life, everyone's having to adapt. So I'm getting emails and seeing how theatre companies are adapting and putting on different types of performances. It is possible to do theatrical performances online as well, and for people to engage with them that way, and for new business models to emerge.
The 90-second burst of Mars by Gustav Holst was followed by the sound musicians fear most: silence. Simon Harris, ITV News, Westminster.
2 terror suspects from West London are on their way to the US to face charges of killing hostages in Syria. Alexander Cote and El-Shafi El-Sheikh are accused of executing Western captives in what was the so-called Islamic State. They were nicknamed the Beatles because of their British accents. Our correspondent Simon Harris has more.
The American justice system has finally caught up with El-Shafi El-Sheikh and Alexander Cote. And in Washington today, the authorities didn't hold back.
Cote and El-Sheikh were members of the notoriously brutal ISIS hostage-taking cell that became known as the Beatles.
These alleged terrorists both grew up in the United Kingdom, where they became radicalized.
Now they're going to face justice in an American court of law for crimes against American citizens.
Cote and El-Sheikh were captured by Kurdish fighters 2.5 years ago. In interviews with ITV News last year, they denied murdering any Western hostages, but admitted guarding them.
First came into contact with some of these prisoners in that area, the countryside, for a brief period.
As for the execution and the remains, and I'm afraid I can't offer any answers to those questions because I don't have any knowledge of it.
Both men grew up in West London and at some point became radicalised. They're said to have worshipped at a mosque in Ladbroke Grove, but Cote was thrown out for trying to set up a prayer group. Their journey from London to Syria and the so-called Islamic State will form part of the case against them. They face charges of hostage-taking resulting in death and plotting to murder US citizens. James Foley, an American journalist, was one of their 4 alleged victims.
They were 4 unique, passionate young Americans, and all risked their lives pursuing a greater good.
If you have American blood in your veins, or you have American blood on your hands, you will face American justice.
If they're found guilty, Coty and El Sheikh face life in an American prison, but not the death penalty. Simon Harris, ITV News.
Good evening, I'm Duncan Golostani. Until now, the rising number of coronavirus cases have been most concern in the east of the city. But ITV News analysis of Public Health England's latest figures suggests Richmond now has the highest case rate in the capital, 103 per 100,000, after cases more than quadrupled in a week. It is a snapshot of the situation in London tonight, and while cases are far fewer than in the northwest and northeast of England, there are concerns we're on a similar journey to high rates of infection and stricter lockdowns. Our political correspondent Simon Harris has the latest.
Richmond-upon-Thames might seem a world away from the COVID hotspots of the East End, but suddenly this West London borough is on the front line. The number of new cases in the last week has doubled and doubled again, a 4-fold increase.
There's no rhyme or reason to it whatsoever. We've looked at the figures, we've looked at the data, we've not seen any particular hotspot. It's not attributed perhaps to, we've got a university, we're not seeing that is coming into play at all. It's just a general part of the general trend we're seeing across London of an increase in cases.
ITV News analysis of Public Health England data suggests the number of cases in Richmond has jumped to 103.6 per 100,000 people. Not far behind is Redbridge in East London, with 103 cases per 100,000. That's 4 times higher than Sutton in South London, the borough with the lowest figure of 26.4 cases. This government website narrows it down even further to individual council wards. And in Richmond, the worst affected areas are North Sheen and East Sheen North, with around 30 cases between them. People we spoke to weren't surprised about the rise in infections.
I think some other people in this council are not being so careful, actually. Particularly in terms of travel and not quarantining upon their return.
Lots of people have nobody they know who is sick. So it feels like it's happening to somebody else.
I haven't really been going to any shops, but my husband says it's quite a few shops that people aren't wearing masks in. So that's a concern.
Stefano Bergamon's family has run an Italian restaurant in Richmond for 21 years. Social distancing, the rule of 6 and the 10 p.m. curfew have all taken a toll on the business. The prospect of further lockdown measures fills him with dread.
Please, we can't do that anymore because business is already tough as it is. We definitely do not need another lockdown. So we try to work around this, but without a lockdown.
For now, the government's focus is on the north of England. But as more Londoners test positive, new restrictions here seem increasingly likely.
Yeah, well, how likely then, Simon?
Well, late this afternoon, the Mayor Sadiq Khan and representatives of the London boroughs held another emergency meeting to discuss what's happening in London. And I think it's safe to say the mood there is one of alarm at the spread of the virus in London. They say it's accelerating in every part of London, even those parts where it was low. And basically the message is Londoners should regard additional restrictions as very likely, very soon.
OK, it is worrying. Thank you, Simon.